Well, good evening, everyone. As Angela said, my name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides. And so I specialize in Canadian battlefields predominantly of the First and Second World War. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is a section of First World War Canadian history that most people don't know about. We're going to talk about two battles in particular, the action at Saint-Éloi Craters and the Battle of Mount Sorrel, one of which has a huge memorial to it and it's quite significant in a lot of ways, which I'll get to. And the other one, nobody's ever heard of unless you have tripped over this little town in Quebec called Saint-Éloi. Just to give you a perspective, behind me is my background photo. That is one of the mine craters blown in front of the village of Saint-Éloi, and that's looking southeast towards Mount Kimmel, which is in the background. That's taken in 1919, and we can know that from the guys walking around, and there's a working road in the back, which didn't exist in 1915 and 1916. The other reason I know these Canadians in the photo are actually 1st Canadian Division guys is that they're armed with Lee Enfield rifles. The official caption and the date time of the photo is March of 1916. In March of 1916, most Canadians were still armed with the Ross Mark III rifle. The 1st Canadian Division had basically abandoned it under Currie's orders to adopt the Lee Enfield because the Ross was not a spectacular rifle and they had more combat experience. So little kind of points and notes that this is what your kind of First World War is going to look like a little bit. So Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies I'm going to talk about or recommend, any apps or products named in this presentation, and they're not sponsored by and do not sponsor or endorse any of these products. So just to let you guys know that. These are all places that I recommend, that I use as a guide. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk a quick overview. We're going to talk about some recommended preparations, travel advisories, some helpful hints and tricks, some must-try places in the Ypres Salient. They're some of my favorite places to go visit. I hope to go there this weekend. Some of the great places to stay that I've stayed at and other guides that I have worked with use. Transportation, which can be a challenge. We'll talk about what Canada was doing in the Ypres Salient and its overview of what it did before we get to the battles. And then we're going to talk about the actions of Saint-Éloi Craters, which happened between the 4th and the 16th of April, 1916, and is Canada's greatest defeat in the First World War. Then we're going to move northwards to the Battle of Mount Sorrel from the 2nd to the 13th of June, 1916, which was an absolutely epic battle, and it was a big bloodletting for Canada. And while it was a success and a victory, it was actually kind of controversial in a lot of ways. But it's an interesting battle, and there's lots of great places to see there. And we're going to talk about like what you're going to see in the salient, and then a couple of little other points. So those Canadian troops are in Plug Street Wood, which is not far from the village of Plug Street. They actually call it Plug Street if you're British, because of course they can't pronounce words in any other language but English. And as you can see, there's lots of trees around. So this is like before the epic mass destruction that's going to come in 1916 and 1917. And 1916 is the year where artillery bombardments go from big to epic. So we're talking about the country of Belgium in the region of West Flanders. It's got a population of almost 1.2 million people. Their language is West Flemish, which is a version of Dutch. The closest main airports that I would recommend is Brussels Airport itself or Brussels Charleroi. Both are super convenient and only a couple of hours away. Quick background, the region is an old cloth town and lots of old farming communities in this area. It's the actual cloth halls from the 1300s. The town of Ypres got a advanced starport, and it's lots and lots of water in this region. Belgium is actually the 10th most expensive country in Europe, so it's a little bit higher than the average, but that's okay because their food and beer are epic. The Ypres Salient was a 24 square kilometer battle zone and was an active battlefield for the entire war from 1914 right till the end of 1918. And there were 5 major battles named the Battle of Ypres: 1914, 1915, 1917, and then there was 2 of them in 1918. And there was tons of smaller little actions and battles, and we're going to talk about 2 of them. It's known for its high number of cemeteries and memorials to units, as well as its most famous memorial to the missing, the Menin Gate. Canada has 3 memorials to itself just in the Ypres Salient alone. We're going to see one tonight. And it's also, of course, as I said, got the Menin Gate, which is a significant memorial, and they do a ceremony there every single night of the year. So Belgium is a generally mild climate. It's got wet, cool winters and warm, dry summers. The best time to travel really to the Ypres Salient and in that region is really the end of April till about the middle of November. After that, it gets really wet and hard to get around, and things are closing because, of course, the tourists aren't there. Rain jacket is always really good. I get rained on in Ypres like every time I go. So always bring a raincoat with you. It helps break the wind. And please remember good footwear. Some of these places you're going to go to are going to be a little bit muddy, and especially in the cemeteries and some of the bunkers and all that, you want good footwear and good footing. Always a good idea. Travel with travel insurance. Every memorial, they're all child friendly. Most places in the area are child friendly. Just remember that this is you don't want to climb on some of the monuments. It's kind of dangerous. And there's no city passes around Ypres. It's a pretty small little place, but it is totally worth visiting. So, travel advisories. Belgium's a relatively safe country. Bigger cities have greater crime problems than the smaller ones, but always read those just to be safe. Risk of terrorism is always a challenge, especially at Brussels, but generally it's quite good. There's no visa requirements for Canadians, max 90-day stay. Petty crime is always a challenge, but Ypres actually I find really safe. I've never had any issues at all in Ypres. There is a hospital there. 112 is its emergency number, and its main consulate, and the only one in the country, is in Brussels. It might be because it's a very small country, but it's got one. So, helpful tips. Always dress for the weather. It turns you on at a dime. I have been rained on pretty epically, actually, at this memorial that we're looking at in this photo right now. Lisa might remember that day. We had to hide under a tree. It's close to the sea, so it can get really quite chilly. Like the weather will change quite quickly. Please don't climb on the monuments. That's exactly what they are. They're memorials and monuments to the fallen and to the units and the men that fought there. Some of them actually even have ashes spread around them or remains. They're considered consecrated. So please, it's a really big deal. We had the Commonwealth War Graves Commission lose their mind on some people at Tyne Cot once because they were climbing all over one of the German bunkers, which is also very dangerous. So remember, you're also visiting somebody's home. These memorials, these places are in their farms, on their homes, on their properties. They also work in these places. This is their livelihood. So to allow us to keep visiting, just please be respectful of people's property and parking and things like that. Really, it's really important. The battles in this area were cleaned up after the war, but there are still so much pieces of unexploded ordnance that litter these fields. If you see one, don't touch it. It is exceptionally dangerous. The shell that you see in the top photo is a photo of me at Courcelette, where I parked a van with my group beside and said, "Be careful of shells." And somebody said, "You mean like that one?" And then I pulled away. It happens to me all the time. You see this stuff. It wasn't that long ago. They actually even found some First World War soldiers again recently. So these are things that you need to be aware of, that things can be dangerous, especially with the chemical shells that are now becoming a bit of more of a concern. So please don't touch things or pick things up if it's a full round or shell or artillery or grenade. You see a shrapnel ball, that's one thing. But anything else, just be very careful, please. Always have good footwear. As I said, some have stone paths, but most are grass. Some of them are in fields. You'll be trekking across fields to get to some of these places. They can be muddy. You don't want to be wearing flip-flops. And in this area in particular, this is important. Be aware that some of these divots and shell holes these holes that you're going to be walking in and around and through are actually mine craters and shell holes. So shell holes are less dangerous, but they are big divots. But mine craters are exceptionally dangerous. It might look like a little simple pond, but that might have been a 30,000-pound explosion, and that could be going 30 meters straight down. And there could be things still in the bottom of it because, of course, they didn't clear them. They filled with water. So they can be really dangerous. They can be very deep, and they can be very unstable. Mine craters are one of those things in this region where they try to clean up as many of them as they could. There's actually at least one that they still haven't been able to clear. They know it's full of explosives. They can't find a way to get into it safely. It was left over from the First World War. Lightning strike in 1954 hit another one in the region that they've forgotten about, and it blew up the farm. So these things can be really unstable, so you got to be careful. So the food and beer in Ypres. I always recommend the town of Ypres for food. There's a couple of small shack places you can go for lunches and other places. But if you're in West Flanders, have Flemish stew. It's a beef type stew. It's really quite good. I always recommend Ypres Times Ale. It's my favorite beer from the region. It's named after a British trench newspaper. I've actually got the complete collection of the Ypres Times for Christmas as a gift from my wife in a book form. It's spectacular. It was a trench newspaper by British troops because they couldn't figure out how to pronounce Ypres, so it's Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S. How British. 3 places I recommend. If you want one of the best dinners I've ever had, Den Anker is right beside the Cloth Hall in the main square in Ypres. Phenomenal place to eat. Amazing staff, amazing owners. Cannot say enough about them. If you're just going for a quick beer and a snack, my 2 recommendations are Saint and Arldis, which is on the Menin Road, just before the Menin Gate. Spectacular place. Great beer, great staff, good snacks. Really quite comfortable in and outdoor seating. And around the corner from that is a place called the Sherwood. It was recommended to me. I've seen it several times. I've actually never gone in there, but other guides I've spoken to recently said it's definitely worth checking it out because it's based on the Sherwood Foresters, which was, of course, Robin Hood's men, but it was also up to, I think it was 9 or 10 infantry battalions in the First World War, British battalions that fought here. So those are the places I would recommend. Now, if you're going to spend the night in Ypres, my first choice is always the Novotel Ypres Centrum Flanders Fields. Great hotel, good breakfast, comfortable rooms, super clean, amazing staff. Highly recommended. Great place to stay. But Guild of Battlefield Guides, when we do our recce there in March, we're actually staying at the New Rejoignez Hotel. It's another great hotel. I've never actually stayed in it, but all the guides highly recommend it, and it's their preferred hotel for most of the best guides of the Ypres Salient. And it's actually also on the market square itself. So there's only traditional taxis in Ypres, and there's no rideshare services per se. It is a small town. There are many, many guide companies. The Grenadier bookstore on the Menin Road has a battlefield tour guide service. He's actually Canadian. There are other ones, but you can also go to the website for the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and they've got a whole list of some of the best guides in the world. And in fact, 2 of the best on the subject of Ypres are part of the members of the Guild. They're spectacular. Or you can always talk to me. I spend a lot of time in the Ypres Salient, and I love to guide there. It's spectacular. Please make sure when you're coming to Europe, if you're coming from overseas or from Canada, make sure you have your international driver's license. Lots of countries will not let you rent a car without one, as I've discovered. So let's talk about the Ypres Salient. This is the good stuff. So the Ypres Salient in 1916. So just to give you some background on these photos. So the map on the left-hand side is the Canadian Corps when it first goes into the line in December. So they wouldn't have lined before that, but this is the December of 1915 positions. You'll notice there's something that says CDN Cav BDE. That's the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. So that's one of the few times that the Lord Strathcona's Horse, Royal Canadian Dragoons, and fought alongside the rest of the Canadian Corps, because the rest of the time they fought actually as cavalry in British cavalry divisions and separate from the Canadian Corps. So the top, the left-hand photo of the shell exploding, that's a shell exploding in Canadian positions near the village of Ploeg Street in March of 1916. It's an interesting shot because there's another photo of a Canadian sniper. It's a very staged photo, either just before or just after, but it's the same position because of the stuff in the background. On the right-hand side, that looks like a wonderful fireworks display. That's German artillery pounding a Canadian position in early March 1916. So that's kind of what a bombardment would look like. It's neat. There's not a lot of photos of this time period for Canada because they didn't actually have an official photographer. The troops at the bottom that are sitting down having a meal, they're 1st Canadian Division troops. It is the end of March 1916. They're wearing helmets. That's how we know the time period, because helmets were only newly issued just before then. And we know that they're 1st Canadian Division because of where they're located. That's actually not far from a place called Armagh Wood. Now, what's interesting about this photo is that while they're having a meal, there's a jug at that soldier's feet. I ended up acquiring 2 of those. That's an Army issue rum jug for rum rations. And I have 2 of those being preserved right now for me. I got them in the Somme. And of course, there's the troops in Ploeg Street Wood. Those are more than likely 2nd Canadian Division troops going into the line. So with the arrival of the 2nd Canadian Division in France in September of 1915, the Canadian Corps was now formed. And it took over a front line south of the Belgian town of Ypres in a relatively quiet sector for training and acclimatization. They were joined at the end of December 1915 by the 3rd Canadian Division, which had been formed by units already in France. The PPCLI, which came from a British regular division, the 49th and 42nd Battalions, which were considered corps troops, and the newly arrived from Bermuda, the Royal Canadian Regiment, the only regular infantry regiment we had, and they all formed the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade. The 6 regiments of the Canadian Mounted Rifles that had gone into action and whose performance in the trenches in their first go-round had been so exceptionally poor that they were broken up and turned it into from 6 mounted regiments into 4 infantry battalions, formed the 8th Canadian Brigade. Just for the record, of the COs, 5 of them got fired. So it was interesting. So it was a whole new brigade, essentially, with new chain of command. And the last of it was 4 battalions from the UK came overseas and formed the 9th Canadian Brigade. What makes the 3rd Canadian Division exceptionally unique, and not just because I served with them and I'm a Pro 3 division guy, is they were the only division formed in France in the First World War. Every other Canadian division was formed initially in Canada and came across and formed in the United Kingdom, or were just formed in the United Kingdom from battalions that were arriving. 3rd Division is the only one formed in France. The Canadians actually spent the first 3 months of 1916 basically trying to stay warm and dry as the units rotated through the front line, mixed with trench raids and working parties. Some very spectacular and successful trench raids happened, especially Christmas 1915, actually. They did the spectacular trench raid, 2nd Canadian Division, hugely successful. The Germans retaliated and 8 Vandus were killed. But they basically, the Canadians walked over, they lost 1 in the raid, killed 50 Germans, and then the Germans retaliated and hit a bunker and took out 8 Canadians from the 22nd Battalion. So that's what they were trying to do in these terrible type conditions. The Canadians held a front line from the village of Hooge on the Menin Road, just east of the city of Ypres, running south over the ridges and hills, such as Hill 62, 60, 61, and Mount Sorrel, all the way down and around to the village of Saint-Éloi, not on the frontier with France. There had been some fighting between the British and French in and around Saint-Éloi and other sectors for some control of some high ground features in this area, as well as there had been a significant amount of mining. This was a relatively new invention. They took miners, they would tunnel underneath the ground, plant a couple of thousand pounds, or in some cases 30,000 pounds of explosives underneath positions and then blow them up, which is not very nice and is quite significant in the story. This important tool of trench warfare, by this point in early 1916, had led to 20, and just in the Saint-Éloi sector, 20 German and 13 British mines being exploded in 1915 alone, along with another 31 subsurface explosions trying to blow up the other guys' tunnels that they were trying to tunnel underneath each other's lines, which is an astronomical amount of explosives. This was also the same time period where the British artillery was limited in the quantity of shells available. It was the 1915 shell crisis that started this. And it was still being felt early in 1916. And so in artillery exchanges, the Canadians were at a huge disadvantage to the Germans. While during this period of relative inaction, the Canadians suffered 546 killed and 1,543 wounded. That's between the 1st of January and the 31st of March, 1916. There was a plan to eliminate a German salient and a feature called the Mound, just in front of the village of Saint-Éloi, and it was planned to occur at the end of March. And this would now involve the new and largely untested 2nd Canadian Division. The actions at Saint-Éloi Craters. So the bottom satellite or bottom photo is a battlefield photo. I've marked where each one of the mine craters are. You can actually see the April 10th status where the frontline trenches are, and the other ones were the different days of actions that were going on as the battle took place with the Canadians. This is very significant. You'll see that basically the roads are obliterated in the photo, and you can see the trench lines. And you can, if you look very carefully, you can totally see where the German trench lines match the April 10th photo. This photo was taken sometime after the 16th of April. And I say that because that's when the first time they could actually get up-to-date aerial photography in the battle. So the actions at Saint-Éloi Craters is an unknown Canadian battle, and is the worst defeat that Canada experienced in the Great War. The village of Saint-Éloi, south of Ypres, was on the front line in the winter of 1916, and in fact, parts of the village, the front line actually went through the village, and so the trenches were built into the houses. and was a target for the 3rd British Division attack that was to commence on the 27th of March 1916, and was to attack a feature called the Mound, just in front of the town. And this was basically a big pile of mining spoil and railway cutting spoil that had given a little bit of about a 30-foot advantage over the ground around it. And it gave the Germans, who controlled it, observation over the British lines. The 2nd Canadian Division, at this time under command of Major General Richard Turner, VC, was tasked to act as the relief force for the British regulars once they captured the positions. The plan called for 7 mines to be detonated underneath the German lines, which would then be stormed and consolidated with the Germans being pushed back, which would be stormed. The first ever corps for corps replacement happened in this action, as the Canadian Corps replaced the British 5th Corps, controlling the area for the attack. And this was because Canada insisted that all of its divisions fight together under the same command, which later became the case for the Anzac and Australian Corps, but was not the case for the British Corps. They rotated divisions and they stayed in place. The attack was to go over some of the most cut up and muddy ground on the entire Western Front, and was covered with so many previous mine craters and shell holes, it was almost impossible to maneuver at times. But in order to gain surprise, the British decided that there would be no initial bombardment. The plan was they would blow the mines and the shells would land seconds after those mines detonated. They would start bombarding the German positions. The mines were dug into positions just underneath the German positions. The exhausted British regulars began their attack on the 27th of March, 1916 at 4:15 a.m. And while some of the units succeeded taking their objectives without difficulties, others faltered, and thus began a brutal and messy and confusing fight in this area, with difficulty in just trying to figure out where things were going on. Trenches on both sides collapsed under the weight of the 7 explosions. Landmarks that had been marking the battlefield before disappeared, and then the weather turned. Essentially, this battlefield became so unrecognizable. There were shell craters upon shell craters, upon mine craters, upon mine craters. And there were so many other mine craters, it became very, very confusing. The British troops were so worn down and lost so many troops, it was decided that on the 3rd of April that the 2nd Canadian Division had to go in to replace them, which was much earlier than planned. The original plan was that the Canadians would go replace the British once they captured all of the objectives. Well, the British hadn't. They chewed through 3 infantry brigades to the point where one of them walked out with 547 troops out of about 4,000 that went into action. For the Canadians, there was going to be some new tools of this battle. One of them, of course, as I said earlier, was the introduction of the steel helmet. But to put a bit of context onto this, there was only 50 of them per every infantry company. An average infantry company is about 120 people, and they were considered trench stores, so they would rotate through them. So if you were going into the trench, you would get somebody's helmet, if there was one to be had. And the brigade chosen to do the initial relief in place of the British brigades was the 6th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Ketchum, which consisted of the 27th, 28th, 29th, and 31st Battalions. They began their move in at 3 a.m. on the 4th of April, 1916, into what is best described as a less than advantageous position. And that's an official history quote. The 27th and 31st Battalions moved into the front line first, and they tried to establish their defense on the battered and shattered line. Along with working parties from the 2nd Pioneer Battalion, they tried to make it better. The problem was that the British were supposed to have left 12 machine gun teams behind, Lewis machine gun teams, of which only 4 could be found and only 3 were actually working. They were also supposed to have guides. They didn't show up. And they had a real tough time because there was no maps and no markings and no photography because it had been raining and muddy and the aircraft couldn't fly. So nobody really knew what was going on. One of the battalions literally went forward and their guys spent 2 hours trying to find their way forward only to get lost. The problem was that after all of this work by the infantry and the pioneers, at night, during the day, the Germans would blast all of their work to oblivion. And so all the water drainage was destroyed every time they tried to wire anything in. So the battlefield is littered with bodies. The battlefield around the village is littered with debris. And there's just no way to make this even defendable. After 2 days, the 28th Battalion was sent to help shore up their defenses because of the high numbers of casualties. And the 29th Battalion had to come in and replace the depleted and exhausted 27th Battalion on the 5th and the 6th of April, which also happened to be when the Germans decided to launch their counterattack to retake their lost front line. And within 3 hours of the attack starting, they had captured all of the craters, pushing back or wiping out all of the Canadian defenders. So Canada went forward and replaced the Brits, and then we got attacked and we lost everything. This began a series of actions and errors based on misinformation and incorrect information that would damage the Canadian reputation and lead to loss of men and the loss of all the ground that had been fought for. The 4th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Robert Rennie replaced the 6th Brigade on the front line, taking over the lines and positions that were actually not known where they were by anybody. Nobody actually knew at higher headquarters. Nobody knew at Canadian Corps or 2nd British Army. And the troops at the front line actually didn't know where they were on the battlefield. All the way up to the Canadian Corps headquarters, the headquarters thought that the Canadians actually held all of the craters. But in fact, they were very much short of the crater line, which is what the Germans were holding on to now. And there was no chance for any aerial photography still, because the weather was still awful. General Turner's leadership was less than stellar at this time, never once going forward. And General Ketchen, when his 6th Brigade commander, had literally not done much of anything. But with the experienced hand of Brigadier Rennie, who had been the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion at 2nd Ypres, they worked to improve at what they had and held, even though they reported themselves incorrectly, on their positions. An attack put in by that brigade, the 21st Battalion, on the 8th and 9th of April to try to capture craters 2 and 3 failed, as did an attack the next night by the 18th, 20th, and 21st Battalions on these same objectives. Shortly thereafter, the 4th Brigade was replaced by the 5th Canadian Brigade, Brigadier David Watson, who had commanded the 2nd Battalion at 2nd Ypres, and he's a British Quebec newspaperman, later to command the 4th Canadian Division, in fact. And his brigade was made up of the 22nd French Canadian, the 24th Victoria Rifles of Canada, the 25th Nova Scotia Rifles, and the 26th Battalion. And they came in the line on the 10th and the 11th of April. And it was them, specifically a Major J.A. Ross of the 24th Battalion, Victoria Rifles of Canada. My family, actually my great uncle fought with him. So my great uncle is a signals officer for the 24th Battalion in this battle. So he actually won the DSO because it was him who went forward on an individual reconnaissance and determined that the Germans at this point, on the 10th of April, were actually holding craters 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it was confirmed by aerial photos a few days later, which ended the battle completely. The Canadian attacks were all ordered ceased, even though they'd been chewed up and spat out, and the men were struggling and being replaced on a near every day or 2-day basis. In the 2 weeks that the division fought in this area, they had lost all of the ground and the men, 1,300 in total, with one commanding officer actually being fired. That was Lieutenant Colonel Snyder of the 27th Battalion. And there were calls from General Haig for the 6th Canadian Brigade commander, General Brigadier Ketchen, to be fired. Luckily enough, Canadian politics interfered and saved him. For Turner to be sacked, again, politics saved him, but not for very much longer. He only remained in command for a few more months. And in the end, it was the Canadian Corps commander who was replaced due to the Canadian politics of Sam Hughes and Lord Beaverbrook, with Lieutenant General Julian Byng being brought in to replace Lieutenant General Alderson at the end of May 1916, concluding a rather unfortunate and messy chapter in Canadian military history. What can you visit on this battlefield? Well, you can visit 2 of the mine craters, that is craters 3 and 4. They still exist, although one of them was a second blow, so it doesn't quite look like it did in 1916, because again, there was more craters after that created. But the rest have all been either filled in or cleaned up. One of them was actually in the middle of the road, so they've actually had to clean that one up. There are also several cemeteries that are worth visiting in this area, such as Vormezila, enclosures number 1, 2, and 3, which have about 130 named Canadians from the period. And that was right behind the Canadian front lines. You can visit La Latterie Military Cemetery, which has 190 Canadians from the period, including the first Indo-Canadian to fall in the First World War for Canada. They had 10 of them served, there was 25 of them served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and 10 of them were killed in action, and this is one of them. He's an original member of the 24th Infantry Battalion. I'm going to show you his headstone in a second. You can also visit Ridgewood Cemetery, where there are 292 Canadians from the actions in this time, and the old and new military cemeteries at Dickbush with about another 90. So there's not many photos from the action itself, but you can tell, and the two left-hand photos, those are actually British troops on the 27th of March that were replaced right away. So the first battalions that went in got pulled out right away 24 hours after the action because they were so exhausted and so worn out. The top one are some British privates lighting a cigarette on the road just outside of Saint-Éloi, and then the other one is some British NCOs also enjoying a cigarette as they're being pulled out. But you can just see the absolute mud and muck of the area. But you'll also notice there's lots of trees in the area still. So this is, again, before the big, massive, like million-round bombardments begin. The first real epic bombardment is going to happen in July of 1916, but in France. Though the Germans were pretty good at smashing the Canadians pretty hard. So the bunker at the top left is kind of the brownish photo. That is supposedly Canadian troops in Saint-Éloi in a reserve position after coming out of the line. And you'll notice that they're all wearing steel helmets. And I say supposedly because that's what the photo caption says. So those are supposedly Canadians at that time. It's interesting that there's a bunker in the background. That's not a big feature of 1915 construction. So there is some question as to that in the photo. But everybody says that that is a Canadian position just outside of Saint-Éloi. Now again, and those are the troops on the 29th of March. And I said, this is, it's not a traditional trench like you would think. This was part of the reason for this was because you couldn't dig down because the water table was so high. It's very common in the Ypres Salient, this style of trench system, and they would build these things to be several feet thick and deep, and they would try to dig them in and make them as bomb-proof. And that's why actually not far from Saint-Éloi, you can actually see British bunkers and defensive positions that are actually concreted from later in the war, where they realized they had no choice but to actually build up, vice dig in. Interesting kind of concept. When we think of the First World War, we think of deep underground trenches. Not always the case. So this is what it looks like today. So that's one of the mine craters that you can go visit at Mine Crater Saint-Éloi. So there are some around that area that are 1917 ones, some are 1916 ones, there's some 1915 ones, there's one that's not blown up still. You can find them all on Google Maps. It's pretty easy to see. The map in that bottom corner shows you the village of Saint-Éloi and a couple of the mine craters you can visit. The cemetery, that's Vermezil Cemetery on the bottom left-hand corner. It's one of the enclosures. It's actually a wartime cemetery. The guys would be killed. They'd be brought back there. It's like where the ambulance and dressing stations were, and they would be put into there. But there's a ton of cemeteries in this area. Not all whole Canadians. But that center photo is the young man Singh, Guru Singh. He's 24th Battalion. He actually died late 1915 as a member of a working party, just out being on a carrying party, and he was killed in action. So I found him. This is my photo. I was taking somebody there. He had a British relative that had fought not far from here, and that's at La Latterie Cemetery. And I tripped over this guy. There's a whole bunch of 24th Battalion guys, and I saw the dates. And I'm like, oh, wait a second. I have family that fought with these guys. And I tripped over him, and I was kind of really shocked and surprised. And then that's when I did the research and discovered there was all of these. So people from the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that's what we call, it was British India at the time. There's about 50 Japanese Canadians. And then of course, there's the African Canadian, Caribbean Canadian grouping. They're still not sure because of course the name issues. But there's a large number of minority, what we would consider minorities, especially at the time, fighting in the CEF. And this gentleman actually had fought in the British Army before he came to Canada, and he actually joined in Montreal. He's an original member of the battalion of the 24th Victoria Rifles. So this is one of the most epic battles that Canada fought. Most Canadians have never heard of, and I hadn't really heard of it when I brought my family here in 2020 before lockdown kicked in again. And I wanted to go to Ypres just to see the last post ceremony. It was before I was a guide, and I saw this memorial. I'm like, let's go check this one out. And deep dived in, and I have walked this ground. It's spectacular. But it's also a pretty big failure for Canada. But it was a success and a failure. It's an interesting battle. And this is the Battle of Mount Sorrel, which took place from the 2nd to the 13th of June, 1916. So with the 2nd Canadian Division still licking its wounds and rebuilding itself after the actions in the early spring at Saint-Éloi, The new Canadian Corps commander, Lieutenant General Julian Byng, took over at the end of May 1916. In his first days on the job, he tasked Major General Malcolm Mercer, the commander of the 3rd Canadian Division, to make the first ever deliberate Canadian attack of the First World War. Every other time we did anything, it was a counterattack or it was part of another operation. It was never just a Canadian attack. This was supposed to be the big attack. Interesting, Malcolm Mercer was a 1st Brigade commander at 2nd Ypres, Toronto lawyer, single, very professional, considered one of the best commanders of the First World War up to this point. It was interesting. He was not given command of the 1st or the 2nd Division. He was made commander of the Corps troops. So he was the deputy Corps commander when the Canadian Corps was formed, essentially. So that should tell you where he sat in the pecking order of things. So the 3rd Division that held the section in the north of the Canadian Corps sector, from the village of Hooge on the Menin Road as far south as the place called Mount Sorrel on the far side of Amag Wood, which is quite well marked on this map. The 7th Canadian Brigade held from the village of Hooge through Sanctuary Wood with the RCR and then the PPCLI. South of them was the 8th Canadian Brigade, and they held from Sanctuary Wood to Mont Sorrel with the 1st and then the 4th Battalion's Canadian Mounted Rifles. Opposite them was the 13th Royal Württemberg Corps. Making this battle really unique is that it was two national armies within bigger imperial armies that are going to fight this battle. It's really kind of a unique thing on the First World War battlefield. The morning of 2nd of June, 1916, Major General Malcolm Mercer met up with Brigadier General V.A.S. Williams, of the commander of the 8th Canadian Brigade, and the two went forward about 6 a.m. to do a reconnaissance of Mont Sorrel and Tortop. Tortop is another name for the feature right beside Hill 62. For the upcoming Canadian attack. They arrived at the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, and the Germans began a massive and violent bombardment along the entire 8th Canadian Brigade front and hitting part of the PPCLI and the 7th Canadian Brigade. The worst hit area was actually where 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles and the Brigadier and Major General were, destroying the Canadian lines and inflicting such horrific casualties that 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles suffered 89% casualties, with only 76 men out of 706 engaged coming through unscathed. The bombardment wounded Brigadier General Williams and the CO of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, Lieutenant Colonel Usher, who were both later captured, and it killed Major General Mercer, and he's the highest ranking Canadian general ever killed in action as a Major General. In fact, they couldn't find him for a couple of days, which was a bit of a problem. And the commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles, Colonel Shaw, was also killed in the battle. At 1 p.m., the bombardment stopped, and then the Württembergers exploded 4 mines just in front of the Canadian trenches and in front of Mount Sorrel, and quickly stormed what was left of the Canadian positions of the 8th Brigade, and quickly capturing everything and pushing into the supporting 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles, who were holding on in a place called Maple Copse. They ended up losing their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Baker. So the 8th Canadian, this is the 3rd Canadian Division. In the first hours of this battle, they've got 2 COs that were killed. The Brigadier was captured. Another CO was wounded and captured. And their divisional commander was killed. At Sanctuary Wood is where the Württembergers ran into trouble, with a company from PPCLI on the very right-hand side of their position being destroyed, but the remaining men fought a fierce action, losing their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Buller, as he directed the defense. And there's a huge painting of him actually standing on top of the parapet in the battle. It's a fairly famous one. Eventually, they lost their right-hand front line, but that was it. But it cost them a terrible. After 24 hours of fighting, they'd suffered 400 casualties. Almost 50% of the PPCLI were killed or wounded in this action. There's about 150 actual dead. The Germans actually could have pushed on farther, punching through the Canadian Mounted Rifles. But perhaps they were so surprised at their success, they just chose not to go on. They just decided to consolidate their new position. What is interesting is, though, and you can see it on this map, you'll see it marked at the bottom where the gun positions were. This is the only time that Canadian field artillery pieces were captured in the First World War. The crews fought at their guns until they were cut down. All the entire gun crews were killed, but they were called the sacrifice guns, and they were close to the front line and were firing over open sights at the Germans until they were overrun. What's interesting about this is that the Germans captured the guns, but they didn't take the guns. And I'm going to get to that in a second. General Byng ordered that all the ground be immediately retaken in a counterattack. But the delay in getting units into the positions and bringing up reinforcements pushed the attack into the morning of the 3rd of June, 1916. The units that came up were the ones that were left from the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, specifically the 49th Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel William Griesbach Barracks in Edmonton. And they came in from the north, and they had some help from the 43rd Battalion of the 9th Brigade. And they were also supposed to be supported by the 52nd Battalion, who was coming up. But their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hay, went missing when he was going forward with his troops. And the 52nd failed to get into position or failed to participate because of that. The 14th and the 15th Battalions from the 1st Division's 3rd Brigade, who were in reserve, came forward. And the 7th Battalion of the 2nd Canadian Brigade also put in an attack from its lines towards the point of Mount Sorrel. The attack was a complete and utter failure. The concept was they were going to launch 6 green rockets up all at once, and everybody would go forward in an attack. The rockets didn't all fire at the same time. Not everybody saw the rockets. It was a debacle. They all went in one at a time. As they did, all of them got shut down, pushed back, or halted, except for the 49th Battalion, who actually made significant progress. Their CO was so furious for the other battalions not actually fighting to the bitter end. And his actions ended up plugging the gap in the line, and they actually ended up capturing just in front of the PPCLI original front line. But then the attack was called off because of the high casualties. Knowing that a deliberate attack would now be needed to take it, and that there was going to be no additional resources, because at this time, this is June 1916, the Somme offensive was going to begin in 3 weeks in France. And that's where all the extra artillery, all the extra infantry, everything was going into there. So Byng knew this. So he turned to the commander of the 1st Canadian Division, Major General Currie, because he didn't trust Turner. After Turner's performance, his reputation was pretty poor. Mercer's was excellent, and Currie's was quite good. So he turned to Currie, who devised a plan using regular bombardments to destroy the work the Germans were doing to consolidate their new front line, and make them think that another counterattack was going to be sprung every time there was a bombardment, forcing them into either defensive positions or to become complacent. Currie then decided that he was going to group his attacking units into 2 composite brigades led by his most capable commanders, and carried out thorough training in preparation for this battle. The attack was originally planned for the 6th of June, but bad weather for a week caused a pause to the plan. But that same day, on the 6th of June, the Germans sprung another surprise. This time, they blew 4 more mines under the village of Hooge. The 2nd Canadian Division had moved up the 6th Brigade into position to support and replace part of the 7th Brigade. And when that happened, the 28th Battalion was in the village of Hooge, and one of its companies was wiped out by the mine explosions. But between them and the 31st, they fought a delaying action, but eventually the town of Hooge fell to the Germans. Byng decided that it wasn't worth it to take the town of Hooge, and nor did he have the resources, so he left it to the Germans. And you can actually see the remains of the Hooge mine craters to this day. One is now a cemetery. They filled it in. It's Hooge Crater Cemetery. It's a massive cemetery you see on the way to Mount Sorrel, Hill 62, Sanctuary Wood. And you can actually visit some of the mine craters in and around the Hooge Museum. From the 9th to the 12th of June, 1916, 4 intense bombardments hit the Württembergers, and with no attack, they assumed it was just to cause a nuisance and disrupt them. But during the day of the 12th, they suffered a 10-hour-long bombardment, which had some specific targeting on the positions on their left and right flanks, because they were trying to take out machine gun in positions that could hinder the Canadian advance. On the evening of the 12th, after another 30-minute quick and intense artillery attack, the Canadian infantry began to move to their starting positions just after 8:30 p.m. The quiet night was shattered by the heavy 45-minute bombardment that opened the Canadian attack, with the infantry stepping off at about 1:30 in the morning behind a smoke screen and in pouring rain. The attack was made from Sanctuary Wood to Mont Sorrel by the 58th in support, the 13th on the north side of, the 58th at Sanctuary Wood, the 13th Battalion on the north side of Observatory Ridge, retaking Hill 62 where the monument is today, launching their attack roughly from Maple Copse. The 16th Battalion, the Canadian Scottish, on the southern side of that road on Observatory Ridge and capturing Hill 61, and the 3rd Battalion capturing Mont Sorrel. with the 2nd Battalion clearing Armagh Wood and pushing the Germans all the way back to within their front line, their original front line, within 1 hour of the attack starting. The artillery plan and the reconnaissance was so significant. The intelligence that Major General Burstall, the Canadian Corps artillery commander, had, his thought was that he wanted the infantry to walk with their rifles slung when they went into the advance. Other than there was no mines detonated by the Canadians, Currie really did not like using mines at all. It was a repeat of the Württemberger attack of the 2nd of June. When this battle ended on the early morning of the 13th of June, 1916, it ended with a total cost of 8,000 Canadian casualties and almost no change in the front lines. Other than Hooge, no ground changed hands. The original location selected for the main Canadian memorial after the First World War happened to be Hill 62. So this is where the Vimy Ridge Memorial that we all like to go visit was originally supposed to be built, because it was actually the very first time the Canadian Corps ever attacked. And that's where Currie wanted it and most Canadian veterans. But Mackenzie King was a member of Parliament, and he argued that Vimy Ridge was better because it was the time where the first time the 4 Canadian divisions attacked together and were in battle at the same time together. It also happens to be the only time that happened, because every other time it was only 2 in the front and then 2 in replace. So Vimy Ridge is actually a really, really, really unique battle in that sense. So it was changed to Vimy Ridge, and it only got at Mount Sorrel, Hill 62, Sanctuary Wood, only got your typical granite block. So it is one of the 8 Canadian memorials and one of the 3 in the Ypres Salient to Canadians, the other being Saint-Julien, the Burning Soldier, and the other one being Passchendaele, which everybody both knows of those 2. Now, what can you see about this battle? Well, of course, you can go to where the Canadian Memorial is, and that's actually where you can actually go to that memorial. It's just off of Observatory Ridge. You can actually see maple copse from the memorial and vice versa. And it is on this area. It's in the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles section. It's actually kind of near the border where 1st and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles joined. And that's where the memorial is today. And it's quite a spectacular memorial to go visit. What else is around there? Well, there's Sanctuary Wood Museum, which is just behind the memorial. And those are support trenches from the Canadians, specifically. There's some PPCLI, spent some time there actually earlier before that, but as well, that's where 4 CMRs, some of its support positions were back there, and that was trench lines through the whole First World War. They're very well preserved. It's got an amazing collection of crap and World War I remains and stuff in trenches. It's all original. So that's the Sanctuary Wood Museum. It's also a cafe. And beside it is the Sanctuary Wood Cemetery. It was one of 3 cemeteries that were in that area. One was completely destroyed, one was mostly destroyed, and the one that's there now is the one that they finished rebuilding. And there's a whole slew of special memorials in there. There's more unknowns than knowns because of the destruction of the other cemeteries in the battle and its proximity to the front line. You can also visit Maple Copse Cemetery, which is this beautiful little quiet out-of-the-way cemetery. It's really unique. The first row of those headstones in that cemetery was a trench line in the First World War. It's a lot of it, if you see photos from the period after the war, it was completely shattered. There was lots of destroyed graves. So most of the headstones in there are special memorials because they're soldiers that were known to be buried there, but their graves were lost or destroyed. So you can go see that. It was a dressing station. It was a front line. It was a cemetery. It's quite significant. At the corner, actually, as you come out of Maple Copse and you're trying to get onto the road that's on Observatory Ridge, there's actually a Canadian memorial there to the 15th Battalion, the 48th Highlanders. They have a series of memorials kicking around the Ypres Salient from their First World War. They're private unit memorials. They're pretty modern, but there's one there. How do you know it's there? Because when you pull up this road, there's this massive Canadian flag flying on top of this thing in a cornfield. And that's how I literally found it. My wife pointed that there was a Canadian flag, and I told her she was crazy, and I was wrong. But it's quite neat, and it talks about the 15th Battalion there. You can also go around and see the Ypres Crater Museum, which has got a phenomenal collection. It's a great museum, lots to see there about the action in and around Ypres and the Canadians and the Brits that fought there. There's Ypres Crater Cemetery, which has got a ton of Canadians. It's another massive, I think it's about 6,000 or 7,000 headstones in there. It's quite significant. It's hard to miss. You can also see the Burr Crossroads Cemetery. So that's actually an entry point where Canadian battalions would come out of Ypres and go down that road into the trench system to get into the front line, to get into this battle. So there's cemetery there, there's Canadians there as well. And you can also go back as far as Perth or China Wall Cemetery. That's where, and Bedford House Cemetery. So Perth China Wall was actually a wall that was in place, and that's where Canadian troops, another point where they were coming into the battle to go forward. That's where a lot of troops were coming up. That's where 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles support positions were when they went forward to help support the 5th. And of course, Bedford House Cemetery, there's a ton of Canadians there because that's where the casualties were hauled to when they were hauled off the battlefield. So there's a lot to see in this area. When you drive down the Menin Road or you come around the backside of Observatory Ridge, you are literally driving through the battlefield itself. It's incredible. The roads are small, be careful. And there are a lot of farm roads, but you'll see lots of war remains, railway pickets, or railway ties used as farm post pickets, screw pickets used for fences, for animal pens, all sorts of stuff like that in this area. So that's a Canadian trench line and sanctuary wood, and reserve it's sometime after the battle because it's dry. But those are Canadian troops in a trench. You notice they're almost all wearing helmets now. This is now standard issue to everybody is wearing a helmet. And so that's kind of neat. The picture on the right is the positions of the sacrifice guns. Remember how I said they captured the guns? Well, the Germans forgot to haul them away. In the 2 weeks that they held the ground and held the guns, they never moved them. So when the 13th Battalion stormed up that ridge, they recaptured the guns for the Canadian artillery. So they actually they fell into German hands, but they were never lost. So interesting, that bottom right-hand photo, there's a series of them. I picked this one. That's a soldier as he's being hit by a German shell in July 1916. So after the battle, but this is in near Mount Sorrel itself. He's actually pictured being treated by first aid and then hauled away by stretcher bearers after the bombardment. But yeah, that's an actual action shot of him getting hit. In action, he's never been identified as far as I know. One of the few more period photos, the one on the right-hand side, typical in Highlander fashion. One of them, of course, is refusing to wear his helmet because, heaven forbid, Balmoral will keep you safe. But those are members of the 13th Battalion consolidating Hill 62 on the 13th of June. A photographer went forward and got that photo of them digging in and consolidating their positions on Hill 62 and in the frontline trench positions. So those are Black Watch guys, which is kind of neat. So, as I said, where can you see? So the trenches and the corrugated stuff, that is Sanctuary Wood Museum. Great, you can go through the trenches. They got a great collection. It's awesome. The bottom is Burr Crossroads Cemetery. Beautiful little quiet cemetery. Not far, like right off the main road. You can use it to get to Hill 62 Sanctuary Wood, or you can go up to the next turnoff. That's the Mont Sorrel Memorial, and talks about who fought from Hooge to Saint-Éloi and from April to August. We were actually in that front line position from September of 1915 until the end, but that memorial commemorates the period from April to August when the major fighting took place, i.e. Sanctuary Wood and Saint-Éloi. That's a photo aerial view of, on the bottom right-hand corner, that is Hooge Crater Memorial. As you can see, there's a big circle, or cemetery, sorry. You see there's a big circle there, that church across the street. Yeah, that's where one of the mine craters was. The top left is the 48th Battalion Private Memorial from the unit. And the one beside it is Maple Copse. It's this quiet, rarely visited cemetery. It's peaceful, it's interesting. It's I've done some research for a client because he's a family member fallen in there. There's a Canadian connection. It's pretty spectacular. It's a British soldier, but I was lucky enough to read his service file. And he actually died pretty much, according to the battle reports and the war diaries, almost where the Canadian monument was, which is pretty spectacular when you think about it. It was one of those weird kind of family connection that somebody gave me. So that's what you can see in this battlefield, on top of a great many other things that are nearby. So it's worth to mention that in neither of these two actions was a Canadian awarded a VC for their actions, as the Saint-Éloi battle is almost completely unknown to most Canadians, and most scholars and historians agree it was the least best moment for Canadians. Mont Sorrel and the battle, even though it had the highest ranking Canadian ever killed in action and the highest Canadian ever captured up to that point, and in the Second World War, it was only another brigadier that was captured. And it showed the poor performance of the Canadian Mountain Rifles. They had been rebuilt after their first failed performance, and after this battle, where they didn't perform spectacularly well either, they ended up being retrained again and reformed and rebuilt. But again, nobody's ever heard of it. driving around these battlefields, you can still see lots of war remains, as I said, like bunkers and railway pieces and screw pickets and all sorts of things. Canada would once more, after its successful battle of the Somme and its bloodletting there, and the spectacular victory at Vimy Ridge, return to the Somme in the fall of 1917 to fight at Passchendaele. I hope you all really enjoyed tonight's presentation. Thank you for listening.